All right, well, here we go. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to our Sunday school class on parenting. Today marks the beginning of the third and final unit of the class. So if you've been with us in the previous lessons, in part one of this class, we covered the book Parenting by God's Promises by Joel Beakey. And then in part two of the class, we covered the books by the Tripp brothers. So there was Shepherding a Child's Heart by Ted Tripp, and then the book Parenting by Paul David Tripp. So we are finished with those units of the class, and today we're in the third and final unit of the class where we are addressing contemporary cultural challenges when it comes to parenting. So today I'm going to cover a book with you that I really, really like. I read this book for the first time 3 years ago. It's called Them Before Us by Katy, Faust, and Stacy Manning. Have any of you heard of this book before? I first heard about it through the Colson Center. You familiar with the Colson Center Breakpoint podcast, John Stone Street? So he was the one who first alerted me to the book, and I read it for myself, loved it. I wrote a review of it, put it on my blog, which you could also read if you want. So that's today. And then next week and the following week, Drew is going to cover the book The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. Have any of you heard of Jonathan Haidt before? He is a moral psychologist from New York University. He has done a lot of brilliant work. He wrote a book called The Righteous Mind, which I highly recommend. If you haven't heard of it, it dives into the moral psychology of liberals versus conservatives and why do we think differently when it comes to moral principles. And in his most recent book, The Anxious Generation, he's looking at what is the cause of the rise in rates of anxiety among Generation Z. And so Drew's going to cover that in 2 weeks. And then Pete will cover the book The Tech-Wise Family by Andy Crouch on the 22nd. And then I will wrap up the class with the book Handing Down the Faith, which is a sociological analysis of what are the practices in parenting that successfully transmit the faith from one generation to the next. And so it's a sociological look at transmitting the faith. So that is where we are heading over the next month of this class. So, like I said, this is our focus for the class today, the book Them Before Us. The subtitle there is Why We Need a Global Children's Rights Movement by Katy, Faust, and Stacy Manning. Since this book was published, I think it was first published in 2021, the authors have written a couple other books. I have not yet read these, but I follow them on social media, and I really like their work, and I like what I've seen. They wrote a book called Raising Conservative Kids in a Woke City. So Katy Faust lives in Seattle, Washington. I know this is a somewhat controversial title, but from what I've read of the book, I really like it. And most recently, Katy Faust edited a book called Pro-Child Politics, which looks at everything from marriage to taxation to cultural values. Bioethics, I think, is in there. So there are a lot of various topics that are addressed in that book, Pro-Child Politics. But I wanted to focus on the book Them Before Us today. And what I've done here is I've shown you the table of contents. So these are all the various subjects covered in the class. But today we're only going to cover chapters 2, 3, and 4 because I want to focus specifically on what does this have to do with us as parents. And so today I want to emphasize what they have to say about the importance of biology and gender and marriage when it comes to parenting. So with that said, I wanted to open with an illustration that's not from the book, but I think is relevant for describing where our culture is when it comes to our understanding of marriage and parenting. How many of you know that movie? I suspect most of you have seen the movie, right? When I was a kid, this was one of our family favorites. We owned this on VHS, and we watched it a lot, and I loved it. But looking back on this movie from the perspective of a Christian adult parent, married, my opinion of the movie has changed. And so I want to show you a clip from this movie that comes from the very end scene. So if you know the premise of the movie, right? So Robin Williams he's initially married to Sally Field, and they get a divorce at the beginning of the movie, and they have 3 kids together, right? And Robin Williams is not able to see his kids as often as he wants. So what he does is he dresses up as the nanny and gets hired as the nanny so he can spend more time with his kids. And he puts on this persona, Mrs. Doubtfire. And so it's a comedy. And as the plot unfolds, you can see how it turns out. It's a very humorous movie, but there is also an underlying message when it comes to marriage, divorce, and parenting. And so by the end of the movie, spoiler alert, the mom finds out that the nanny is actually her ex-husband. And turns out, though, that they work through it and they renegotiate custody rights. And so now the dad has more visitation rights with his kids. And so it allegedly ends on a happy note. They're still divorced, but now they share custody of the kids more equally now. And that was thought to be the satisfying resolution to this storyline. But let's take a look at that final scene where Sally Field is at the front door of their house when the dad, Robin Williams, is about to pick up the kids.
That divorce is okay?
Divorce is okay.
Okay, if we fight, we can just move on.
Yeah, if the parents don't love each other, that doesn't mean they don't love the kids. They're just, what's the saying? Different strokes for different folks, right? There are different family structures. Sometimes you have the married mom and dad. Sometimes they're divorced. Sometimes kids are in foster homes. Sometimes they're in adoptive homes. Sometimes they're in step homes. Really, as long as there's love, those are the ties that bind, right? That's the thing that matters. As long as they love the kids, really, the structure doesn't matter. What do you guys think of that message? No. As I look back on this movie, hilarious movie, that's a wicked message, though. I think as Christians, we need to be honest in saying that this is a very destructive message to be communicating. And this is one of the pernicious things about Hollywood. There's a lot of entertaining material that comes out of Hollywood, but this is the sort of thing that indoctrinates us. When I saw this movie as a kid, I didn't know any better. I saw this movie before my parents divorced. And after my parents divorced, I didn't know how to process that. And as many of you guys know, I fell into a season of apostasy for several years in the aftermath of my parents' divorce. Because I just didn't have the right framework for making sense. I wasn't able to put that divorce into moral categories to say that there was sin that happened here. And because I was not able to do that, I just became overwhelmed with anxiety and depression and just did not know how to process it. And since that time, I've had to process through a lot of my past hurts from my parents' experiences. And so, I have firsthand experience with the brokenness of families. My mom has now been married 3 times. My dad has been married 4 times now. And so that has taken an emotional toll on me and my brothers. Not all family structures are the same, right? There is a reason why God commands a particular design for marriage and the family. And when you step outside those boundaries, it causes harm. Now, most recently, just yesterday, I was watching this movie on Netflix. Have any of you heard of this movie? Just recently published. Or not published, but recently released. It's a fantasy movie called Spellbound. It's for kids. The daughter is a princess, and the parents, the king and the queen, have been turned into monsters. I made it about 10 minutes into the movie, and my warning flags, my warning alarm started going off, and so I looked it up online and read a synopsis of the plot. I'm like, oh no, we're not going to watch this. Basically, spoiler alert again, the reason why they were put under a spell is because they kept fighting with each other and they could not learn how to get along. And how do they break the spell finally at the end of the movie and return to their human form? They get a divorce. That's the resolution of the movie, right? That the daughter has to learn that her parents still love her even if they don't love each other, and they're better off apart. This is a message that we are just inundated with within our culture. And so it's a relentless effort on the part of the leading institutions in our society to redefine our conception of marriage and family. Jacqueline, was your hand up there? Yeah.
I don't know if I should share this, but I have a different perspective. Not that I don't agree with what you're saying, but
Okay.
But I remember growing up wishing I didn't want it.
Yeah.
Because the environment in the house was so bad, so
Yeah.
toxic with the fights.
Sure.
And to this day, I still ask my mom,
Mm-hmm.
get out.
Yeah.
I know this isn't godly.
Right.
It isn't what marriage is supposed to be, but it's just, it feels so much worse
Mm-hmm.
when I see two people who are clearly, I don't know.
Yeah.
So
No, that's a fair
I'm
point.
just sharing your perspective.
Sure. No, that's absolutely a fair
I don't know the
point.
answer. I mean, I pray, but it's been years and
Oh yeah.
it's still not.
So, in the material that I'm going to cover today, I do need to give a caveat. Okay, I'm not saying that divorce is never permissible. The Bible does clearly say there are times when divorce is okay, specifically in the case of adultery and in the case of desertion. And within that category, you could arguably make the case that abuse is a type of desertion. There's been debates within our denomination about that subject, and we could explore that at length at some other time if you want to do that. There are times when divorce is permissible. And I should also say that I'm not advocating against stepfamilies or adoption or remarriage or anything like that, okay? I recognize that we do live in a broken world. And things like remarriage and adoption, those can heal wounds in a child's life. But when we live in a system that incentivizes the brokenness, that's when things have gone wrong. Okay, so I think we still need to recognize that the default for a family structure is one husband, one wife, married, having their biological kids together under the same roof. That is the ideal, that is the norm. Now, recognizing that we live in a sinful and broken world, there are exceptions to that, but we don't want to create a system that incentivizes those exceptions or normalizes those exceptions. Okay, so don't hear me beating up on step parents or adoptive parents or anything like that, okay? Are we clear on that? Okay, so I want to say that up front. That said, I do want to make the argument that biology really does matter for kids. It matters that they are raised by the people who actually biologically brought them into the world. And so that is what chapter 2 of the book Them Before Us covers. And here's some of the opening statistics from that chapter, where they talk about the prevalence of non-biological families in America. They argue by age 15, 29% of U.S. children experience 2 or more mother partnerships through either marriage or cohabitation. 40% of children are born out of wedlock. Nearly 60% of the parents of these children already have at least one child from a previous relationship. In other words, the majority of children currently born out of wedlock are born into step families. Further, 40% of married couples with children are step couples. At least one partner has a child from a previous relationship before marriage. This includes full and part-time residential step families and those with children under and or over the age of 18. And approximately 1/3 of all weddings in America today form step families. Again, this is not to say that there's anything inherently wrong with step families, but this should be the exception, right? And so when we normalize this, that is when problems arise for kids in particular. When we deviate from the norm, it's the kids who suffer. And so, addressing the point that is argued in the Mrs. Doubtfire movie, do kids just need love? Is that all that matters, that they're safe and loved? Well, here's what sociological research actually shows us. How many of you have heard of the name Ryan T. Anderson? I love Ryan T. Anderson. He used to work for the Heritage Foundation, but he's moved to a new organization like the Ethics and Public Policy, something or other. I can't remember what it's called. But he wrote the book When Harry Became Sally. Have any of you heard of that book before? It was on sociological research on transgenderism. And that book came out just a few years ago. It was banned from Amazon, and I still think it's not available on Amazon right now. But anyway, he makes this argument. Now, he specializes in sociology, and this is what he argues. According to the best available sociological evidence, children fare best on virtually every examined indicator when reared by their wedded biological parents. Studies that control for other factors, including poverty and even genetics, suggest that children reared in intact homes do best on educational achievement, emotional health, familial and sexual development, and delinquency and incarceration. So in chapter 1 of the book, they give a bunch of statistics that showed like the outcomes for kids that are raised in non-traditional homes. And the numbers are staggering. One of the most significant predictors of social success for kids is whether or not they were raised by both married biological parents. That is more important than pretty much any other factor that can be studied by sociologists. And so they talk about this phenomenon in the book, in this chapter, called the Cinderella effect. Now, you're familiar with the story of Cinderella, right? Cinderella's mom has died. The dad gets remarried to a stepmom who has 2 daughters of her own, and then the dad passes away. So Cinderella is raised by the stepmother with the 2 stepsisters, and she is not treated equally to the stepsisters, is she? It turns out that sociological research has been done by kids raised by step-parents as well, and generally, not to say there's anything, again, nothing wrong with being a step-parent per se, but generally, the measurable outcomes are worse for kids raised by step-parents. So here's a testimonial from one of the individuals that is quoted in the book, and I think this is a pseudonym. There's a website that the authors have produced for kids from broken homes, and so this is one of the testimonials from one of those websites, I believe. The person named Christy here says, "My father's new wife did not want kids in general and did not want us in particular. In truth, we were both a lot of work by then, me mostly because I had very bad asthma and my sister because she was acting out. What also became clear is that she did not want us to be close to our father. We were the interlopers in their private, very adult relationship." And so this is one thing that we need to recognize in the formation of step families. Generally speaking, the step parent, they are seeking marriage to the spouse, and the kids are not the direct intention, right? That's not to say they don't love the kids, and of course in many cases they do, and in many cases step-parents are even better parents than biological parents. But when we're looking at the statistics, on average, kids do worse when they're raised by step-parents.
Hey Kyle, do you
Yes.
know, how does that compare to data on adoption?
So actually, yeah, adoption, in many respects, when it comes to like the experience of love and care and provision by parents, the outcomes are actually better in some cases.
Well, it kind of proves your point in the other
Yeah.
one. They're saying, well, new wife feels like these are interlopers. Well, not if you're busy
Right.
choosing to adopt.
Right. No,
It's not
yeah.
biology, but who's making the choice to have the child.
Right. So in the case of adoption, a lot of the outcomes are even better because in those cases, the parents are clearly intending the child, right? Whereas even in like a married biological couple, they don't always intend the kid. Like I think 25% of the time the kid comes as a surprise. But with an adoption, it's intentional from the very beginning, and the parents are willing to pay that price from the very beginning. So the kids are already entering into a loving home that wants them, right? And so that's why with adoption, in some cases, there are other respects in which even in adoption, there are negative outcomes for the adopted kids. But that's just because they've been wounded, right? The fact that adoption exists is a testimony to the brokenness of our world. It's a good thing we have adoption, but in an unfallen world, adoption would be unnecessary. So anyway, continuing, here are some of the other statistics they talk about regarding kids that are raised in households with unrelated adults. These are some of the disadvantages that they experience. They're about 1.5 times as likely to be living in a household in which it was often difficult to afford basics. They're 5 times as likely to have ever lived with a mentally ill caregiver or parent. They're 6 times as likely to have witnessed neighborhood violence. 15 times as likely to have witnessed caregiver or parental violence. They're 11 times as likely to have lived with a caregiver or parent with an alcohol or drug problem. And they're 17 times as likely to have experienced caregiver or parent incarceration. So the numbers just show us there are all of these harmful consequences to kids who are raised by somebody other than their biological parents. And it might be hard for you to read the text here on this graph, but you want to know what this graph shows you? It's the experience of abuse. Child abuse, whether that's sexual abuse, emotional abuse, or the red there is physical abuse, in the different types of families that they're raised in. On the far left there, you see the rates of abuse, number of children per 1,000 when they're raised by their married biological parents. By far the safest environment for kids is to be raised by their married biological parents. The next over, if they're raised by a single parent. So the numbers do go up. After that, it's when they're raised by unmarried parents. So they may have, they're raised by biological parents, but they're not married. And then the middle there is when they're raised by neither parent. Perhaps they're raised by grandparents or step-parents. And then next over is when they're raised by other married parents. And then lastly, that final, the far right there on the graph, that's when they are raised by a single parent with a partner. The most dangerous environment for a kid, statistically speaking, is when the mom has a live-in boyfriend. By far, like the numbers just skyrocket. When you look at rates of abuse of all kinds, that's the most dangerous environment for kids. And so this is what the numbers show us. And this is why we can argue that biology really does matter. The next chapter is about the importance of gender. Why does gender matter? Well, here's one of the opening quotes from the chapter. The authors argue, unfortunately, we have made a critical error in the noble pursuit of equality under the law. So we live in a very egalitarian society by historical and global standards. But that egalitarianism has come at great cost to our society. We made the mistake of confusing equality with sameness in our quest to defy superficial stereotypes. And we're attempting to erase the natural critical differences between men and women instead of celebrating their complementary uniqueness. See, the mom and the dad each contribute something unique and important and vital to the parenting process. They are not interchangeable. And that's what this chapter is about. So, let me show you a video on the importance of gender.
And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me. Ow!
Come on, if you would just...
Don't.
Okay. How many of you have ever seen that video clip before? So it came out a few years ago. I think I've even showed it in a Sunday school class before. Okay. So we're talking about the importance of gender differences. Everybody recognizes that there is a difference between men and women. We just think differently, right? God wired us that way. And in fact, it's not just a matter of biology. It's part of our creational design. God has designed men and women to serve different roles. We are complementary in the way we think, the way we engage the world around us. In fact, I don't know how many of you picked it up on your way in, but there is a printout back there where I have an extended quote from the book that talks about the importance of gender differences. And I also have an excerpt from another book by a guy whose name is really hard to pronounce, Jay Budziszewski, who wrote a book called On the Meaning of Sex, where he talks about the fundamental differences between manhood and womanhood and why those differences are important and why they matter for parenting as well. See, a lot of people within our society have bought into the notion that gender is just a social construct. Have you guys ever heard that idea before? Gender being a social construct? There are aspects of gender expression that are socially constructed. You know, so for example, when it comes to like clothing, for example, or styles, interests. I mean, there is cultural variability there, but we see patterns in the difference between men and women that are true across cultures and across time and place. That tells us that it's not just a matter of cultural stereotypes. There is something real about the way that men and women think differently. Is your hand up? Yeah.
So what was the point of that video as far as those differences?
So, yeah, that was just...
The woman was just
yeah.
smart.
Right. So that was just meant to sort of be like a humorous depiction of, the way people sometimes understand the differences between men and women. But here what I'm just using that to illustrate is the idea that there are differences. It's not necessarily that like one is better than the, that's absolutely not the case that one is better than the other. But there are different relative strengths and weaknesses between the genders. And we can actually see this in some of the sociological research. So for example, one of the sources quoted in this chapter looks at a survey of high IQ men and women that rank work preferences and life values. So this is what men and women rate as their work preferences and values. And so the top 5 results for men are these, in this order. The prospect of receiving criticism from others does not inhibit me from expressing my thoughts. That's number 1 for men. Number 2, a merit value pay system. Number 3, a full-time career, having a full-time career. Number 4, inventing or creating something that will have an impact. And number 5, a salary that is well above the average person's. And so that's what men generally report as their top-rated preferences when it comes to work life. Women, on the other hand, this is what they rank as their top-rated work preferences. Having a part-time career for a limited time period. Number 2, having a part-time career entirely. Number 3, working no more than 40 hours a week. Number 4, having strong friendships. And number 5, flexibility in work schedule. So we can see the values that they report for themselves are very different. And it's not to say that some answers here are better than the others. These are a matter of preferences that correspond to the way that God has designed men and women. And this is okay. And in fact, as the authors argue here, this is really, really important in how we parent, because the mom and the dad are not interchangeable. We could summarize it this way: moms don't dad, and dads don't mom. So here is how one psychiatrist describes the difference in parenting styles and the underlying hormonal causes to those differences. Parenting styles correlate to biological differences between men and women. Women, compared to men, have higher levels of oxytocin, the hormone responsible for emotional bonding, and oxytocin receptors. Oxytocin serves to calm anxiety, reduce motor activity, and foster an increase in touching. In contrast, testosterone, present in men at levels 10-fold higher than women, is correlated to an increase in motor activity in infant boys and may be responsible for higher levels of physical activities in men compared to women. Okay, so we see different levels of oxytocin and testosterone have a major effect in the way that parents engage in the parenting process. And so what's the consequence of that? One of the arguments that the authors make is, in general, now of course there are exceptions here, dads reflect the world and moms reflect the home. Here's what the quote, and this is on the printout as well for the class today. Here's the section that talks about the role of dads. A father's most essential job is to prepare his child to launch into adulthood, equipped for mission, self-sufficient, and independent. Dad dwells in the realm of facts, and his style of parenting resembles the school of hard knocks. He teaches his children through consequences and allows them to learn through failure. In essence, Dad embodies the world to his children. He prepares his sons and daughters to confidently take on the world. So that's why men more often, and the stereotype, there's some truth in this, men approach problems with a fix-it mentality, right? The problem needs to be fixed. And it's okay. On the other hand, women, moms who reflect the home, and this is how the quote continues. Moms tend to focus on feelings, regardless of the facts. She's wired to nurture and connect, an especially important ability when an infant is completely dependent on her to survive. Mothers set the emotional tone at home and intuitively respond to the physical and emotional needs of her family. In her uniquely feminine way, mom embodies the home to her children. So the mother, because of her unique style of parenting, emphasizes care and nurturing. And of course, does that mean dads can't do that? No. There is going to be overlap. But God has wired the mom and the dad with different unique strengths. And so the mother is regarded as a source of safety and stability and care and nurturing for the child in a way that guys generally don't typically do as strongly. And so they can continue, and here we're going to get to the final chapter that we're covering today, on the importance of marriage. Why is marriage so important for child rearing? This chapter begins with a quote where they say this: marriage has the unique ability to secure children's right to their mother and father by codifying the only relationship with the capacity to create, sustain, and nurture a child. The marital contract is intended to eschew all other romantic interests for good reason. Marital fidelity is essential to raising well-adjusted children. This is one of the big problems that our society is facing right now. We have redefined marriage so that it's no longer centered on the needs of children, it's centered on the wants of adults. And as a consequence of that, kids suffer. They are the primary victims of our culture's redefinition of marriage. It's no longer about a union of a husband and wife for the sake of raising biological children together. Now, how do we define marriage? It's a public expression of a person's emotional attachment to another person, right? And it's society's validation of that emotional attachment. That's what marriage is. But as I'm going to argue in these next slides, that definition is incoherent. If that's our operating definition of what marriage is, all of the principles that define what marriage is start to unravel as a consequence. Now, here's one of the immediate objections that people raise when it comes to the importance of marriage. There are lots of true, valid marriages out there that don't have kids for a variety of reasons. Maybe they can't have kids, or maybe they choose not to have kids. How do we address that objection? Well, here's what the authors say. The fact some marriages don't result in children is the go-to counter-argument to viewing marriage as a child-centric institution. It's true, lots of couples marry and have no children for any number of reasons. But the important takeaway is this: marriage is not a guarantee of parenthood, but is guaranteed every child is the product of a mother and father. Marriage is a child's best chance to have both for a lifetime. That's why marriage as an institution has existed in essentially the same form in all societies throughout history. The whole concept of gay marriage has only existed for the blink of an eye in human history. Now, of course, there have been some deviations. Of course, there have been, polygamous societies, for example. But generally speaking, there has been a recognizable pattern to the definition of marriage across time and place in human history. Now, another question that comes up is, well, what about cohabitation? Isn't that sufficient? What if kids are raised by their biological parents who are not married to each other? That's still going to be harmful for kids. On average, this is what the numbers show us. If they're raised by cohabiting parents, they're 3 times more likely to see their parents break up. They're 4 times more likely to suffer physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. They're 4 times more likely to live in poverty. And they're more likely to use drugs, suffer from depression, and drop out of school. Now, in this chapter of the book, the authors rely on a source that I have also read, and I love this book. This is one of my favorite books on the subject. It's called What is Marriage? And it's co-authored by Sharif Girgis, Ryan T. Anderson, again, and Robert George. Robert George is another favorite contemporary author of mine right now. I wrote a review of this book on my blog as well, so if you're interested in getting the summary of what this book is about, you can check out my blog. But because the authors are relying on this book as well, I have made similar arguments in my case for a traditional understanding of marriage. And what I have attempted to do in summarizing this book is I created some charts here. This is my definition of the traditional view of marriage. So think about this. If marriage is fundamentally built on the principle of being ordered towards procreation and child rearing, if that is one of the fundamental purposes of marriage, a union that is intended to bring children into the world and raise those children together, this explains so many features of our definition of what marriage is. Why should only 2 people get married? Because it takes 2 people to make a baby. Why must it be a sexual union? Because children are the product of a sexual union. Why must it be a permanent union? Because those 2 kids, those 2 adults that brought the kid into the world need to raise that kid for that kid to be healthy and to thrive. Why must the parents be unrelated? Because there are, genetic consequences from inbreeding. And why must marriage be legally protected? Because although marriage is vital to the health of children, it's also a fragile institution. because when you put two sinners together for life, there's going to be a lot of conflict. And so there needs to be the proper social incentives and pressures to make sure that that relationship is nurtured. And that is why we have legal protections that promote marriage. All of these make sense if the fundamental purpose, or one of the fundamental purposes of marriage, is to be ordered towards procreation and child rearing. On the other hand, consider... Yeah, go ahead, Josh.
So if a couple is uninterested in having children, should they refrain from marriage?
I would not say that. But in that case, I would want to dig into why are they uninterested in having kids. Are there medical issues behind that? Or is it simply a matter of personal convenience? I would want to explore that with them. And in fact, I'm going to come back to that point in just a moment. I don't think that necessarily it doesn't invalidate the marriage. But if they are intending to pursue marriage without the intention of having kids together, and it's simply a matter of convenience, I think there is something missing in that definition of marriage and family. But we'll come back to that in just a moment, and then we can discuss that further. I want to contrast this traditional conjugal definition of marriage with the modern redefinition. Now, this is the foundation of the concept of gay marriage, but really it's modern marriage in general. It's no longer ordered towards procreation and child rearing. Now it's ordered towards emotional fulfillment. What is it that will make these two people happy? But think about how that causes our definition of marriage to unravel. If it's simply about personal happiness and emotional fulfillment, why does marriage just have to be two people? What if three people are emotionally fulfilled getting married? What's to stop that from happening? Polyamory is the next logical consequence. And we already see people advocating for that in our society today. Why does it also have to be a sexual union? What's so special about sex if it's not at all related to procreation? Why can't two people in a committed platonic relationship get married? Why does it also have to be a permanent union? I mean, if it's not about child rearing, but it's just about the adult's sense of individual happiness, why can't we include temporary relationships? People who might intend to get divorced later down the road. Also, I know we have kind of an instinctive yuck factor, but let's think logically about it. Why do the two people who get married have to be unrelated? Why couldn't siblings get married if they have that emotional fulfillment with each other? I think most of us would instinctively say, well, that's because it's gross, but why? What if somebody else doesn't have that yuck factor when they think about that? I mean, I don't see a logical argument against that. That's the point I'm making here. And also, why does it need to be legally protected? After all, think of other types of relationships. Think of friendships. You don't need to sign a contract to be somebody's friend, right? You don't need legal protection to be a friend with somebody. Why should marriage be any different? Why does it matter that you have that piece of paper? So, in all these ways, do you see what happens when marriage is no longer defined by the function of procreation and child rearing? The entire definition of marriage unravels as a consequence. That's what ends up happening. Yes, John.
Let me push back on this.
Go ahead.
But it's always struck me that the family itself seems to be look, this is the picture that God has shown you of who he is.
Yes.
And if you mess that up,
you'll suffer. Yeah, there are consequences.
And so will people around you.
Absolutely. And actually, the authors make that same point, too. So one of the authors, Katy Faust, is the wife of a pastor. And so she argues, in this argument, she's deliberately leaving out some of the biblical evidences and arguments for what marriage is. As Christians, we can completely affirm that marriage is meant to be a reflection of Christ in the church, right? And the relationship between a husband and wife is a reflection of Christ's submission to the Father. Absolutely. Here's the thing, though. Those arguments are based on Scripture. How far is that going to get you if you're arguing with a skeptic?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't.
So, yeah. Your argument is 100% correct and persuasive to a Christian.
Yeah.
What I think this argument has the advantage of, though, is you can use this kind of argument with a non-Christian who doesn't share your biblical presuppositions.
And you should always be able to show that the actual data outcomes, if they're not manipulated,
Right.
will be better for the biblical worldview than for anything else.
That's right. So Christians have a more robust understanding of what marriage is, but even two non-Christians can enter into a valid marriage, right? Because it's a creation ordinance. Even if they have no conception about how their marriage is meant to reflect Christ in the church, it's still a true marriage. as long as it meets these, creational ordinance, natural design criteria. The final point I want to make, and Josh, this is kind of coming back to your question about what about like a couple that doesn't intend to have kids? Because that is a common objection to this definition of marriage. I've tried to put together an analogy that I think helps make sense of why should we define marriage as essentially being open to procreation and child rearing. So I'm going to use an analogy from baseball. Some of you might seen me use this analogy before. I think it helps. But here's my analogy. I call this marriage league baseball. Imagine that there's a baseball league with 4 different teams. Team Fertile plays to win. They practice regularly and play by the rules, and sometimes it pays off. Their fans love them and cheer every time they win. Team Infertile also plays to win. They practice regularly and play by the rules, but they never manage to win. Their fans love them and mourn every loss. Here's the important thing. Team Infertile is still a valid baseball team. Okay? It's not their fault if they can't score wins. Team Intentionally Childless does not play to win. They show up to the games, they wear the uniforms, but they have no interest in scoring runs. Naturally, they don't have any fans. They're still a true baseball team too, but they are kind of missing the spirit of the game. But then you have Team Gay. They show up to the games wearing hockey gear. They play by the rules of hockey rather than baseball, but they insist that everyone calls them a baseball team. The other team's fans want them ejected from the league.
Kyle, I have to object here.
Go ahead.
You really need to use hockey as
Okay, I mean, you could use whatever analogy you want. Okay, so no offense to the hockey fans here, okay? So insert whatever alternative sport you want into the analogy. Yeah, Josh, go ahead.
I guess another question going Christian institution that is in the pursuit of glorifying God.
Right. But one of those still corresponds to the natural design for marriage, right? If marriage is naturally ordered towards procreation, there are some relationships that can do that and others that can't. By definition, 2 men cannot do that. 2 women cannot do that. So even if you have a secular heterosexual couple that enters into marriage, and in this analogy, are you saying they don't intend to have kids or they do?
I think either.
Either way, like they're still honoring the structure of what a marriage is. So like here, like in this analogy, Team Intentionally Childless, they're not violating the structure of the game, they're violating the spirit of the game, right? And so like from an outside standpoint, I'm not going to say that team is invalid, like it's not a team, they're just missing the point of the game.
Well, but don't we believe that in a Christian marriage ceremony, something happens? There's a miracle that happens in the union of the man and the woman spiritually together?
Yes.
But that is not the case in a civil marriage. So in that sense, isn't there still something fundamentally missing?
I mean, there is something fundamentally missing. They're missing the supernatural good of marriage. They still can attain the natural good of marriage, though. And so that's why within the Protestant tradition, this is where we differ from Roman Catholics. We don't call marriage a sacrament. We call it a creation ordinance. Because the creation ordinance is for the whole world. Even non-Christians can enjoy and honor what God's design for marriage is.
When you talk about the creation ordinance, are you talking about the command, be fruitful and multiply?
Mm-hmm. And how, God created Adam and Eve in the institution of marriage even before the fall. So those institutions that were created by God before the fall are for all humanity. So other creation ordinances would be like, work or Sabbath rest, right? Or the dominion mandate, to exercise dominion over the earth and to make culture. All those are creation ordinances. That's part of our DNA as human beings. It's how God has wired everyone. And anybody can do those things, even if they're not Christians. It's part of our natural calling as human beings. Now, of course, Christians have a deeper understanding of that calling because they have the supernatural truth of God's revelation given to them. But non-Christians can still honor that creational design within those general parameters, even though corrupted by sin, of course. But it's still so 2 non-Christian spouses can still have a valid marriage. I hope that makes sense. You guys can push back too, by the way. I'm at the end of my slide, so if I've said anything today that you think, I think I pushed back on that or disagree with that, feel free to.
Can Western culture survive with that man? I don't believe it can.
No, I don't think it can either. I think you're right, Brad.
I usually leave the class. It's one thing, but it's the morality behind that.
Yeah.
And if there's no belief in God, we're in serious trouble.
Sure. Now, as a pastor, I need to be careful in the kind of political prescriptions that I give. So I'm going to try to avoid that for now, but we can talk about that offline if you'd like. But I will say this. I think our society is moving in the wrong direction right now. However, we also know that like the fate of humanity does not depend on the future of America, right? God's Spirit is active around the globe, and we see the gospel flourishing in other parts of the world too. And even when our culture is moving in the wrong direction, we as Christians know what our duty is. And our task, I think, right now is to instill the right values in our kids, right? To ensure that the next generation of the church in America survives, right? So I think that is what our focus needs to be as Christians, to make sure that these values, what God's design for marriage and family is, are successfully transmitted to our kids so that they can maintain these values and promote them for the next generation. I think Alan's hand was up next. Go ahead.
To Brad's point in marriage.
The view of things of the people that they're dating.
Yeah.
Or who they've met. Do you see what I'm saying?
That
and
is,
the damage
yeah.
that's done.
As a parent, that's a question that terrifies me. Because the dating pool for the next generation of believers is going to get smaller, right? That's why it's going to be so important to make sure that our kids have the discernment to know what kind of person will make an eligible spouse. What kind of dating partner will help them in the future to raise their kids in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. It's going to be really important. I mean, that requires like a much more lengthy response.
That's another book.
But that's another book. But it's an excellent question, and it's a question that scares me as a parent. Yeah, Haley.
I was going to ask if you could talk about
Mhm.
his children and sort of like, Christ's mandate to care for widows and orphans
Uh-huh.
in distress.
Yep.
How does that play into this? Because I think that's sort of something that's rattling around in my mind.
Yeah. So adoption is a beautiful thing, and I think it would be wonderful if more Christian parents did it. But we also have to recognize that adoption is not the ideal. Like I said previously, in an unfallen world, adoption would not be necessary. In an unfallen world, we would not need to be adopted by God because we would be naturally his children, right? We would have continued in obedience if Adam and Eve hadn't fallen. But adoption is a reality in a post-fall world. That said, there are limits on what healthy the adoption process is extremely rigorous, and for good reason. Because, we want to make sure that kids are adopted into families that will actually love them and care for them. That's why, I am very worried by, the redefinition of adoption criteria to include, gay couples and non-traditional family structures. I mean, yes, any two people or more could hypothetically adopt a kid, but that doesn't mean it's in the kid's best interest, right? The best environment for a kid is that most closely approximates the natural home. Right, and so that's why I think it's important, even in adoption policy, that adoption policy should correspond to God's natural design for marriage and family. Does that point make sense? Yeah, go ahead.
So my follow-up question to that is, if somebody biological children, when there are so many children who come from broken homes, who need families?
Yeah, that's a good question. So are we in this scenario? Is it we're saying it's a heterosexual couple that are just choosing not to have their own biological kids in order to adopt? I don't know. I don't think I see I need to think through that. That makes sense to me, though.
Yeah.
That seems to be. Still, though, the general problem with that, though, is I don't think that's wrong per se in that individual case. But what happens if that becomes the norm for most Christian couples?
Why is it bad?
Well, yeah.
Why is that bad?
I'll speak into it a little bit. I think that there's...
Yeah.
I just think if we're going to have an issue with gay people adopting, we need to rise up as Christians.
Sure.
And adopt
Absolutely.
children.
Yeah, as I think about it initially, I think the scenario you're proposing, I think that is a good thing, a good calling for some people. My concern is if it becomes the norm. What if most Christian couples did this? Then we're not being fruitful and multiplying, right? So if we're just adopting...
How? Because we're taking children.
Yeah,
We're making
no.
children.
Exactly that.
But the net population of the human race is not being replenished, right? So if most people choose not to have biological kids, then we're not being fruitful as a whole, right? So just we're also over time here. So tell you what, that is worth discussing further, but we are out of time right now. So can I close this in prayer, and then we can head to the sanctuary? These are big topics, I recognize. So I'm sure there's a lot of questions or concerns you still have, so I can stick around for a little bit. But let me pray for us so those of us who need to get to the sanctuary can do so. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we do thank you for the gift of marriage, and we thank you for how you have given us your word, and you have not left us in the dark, but you have told us what your will is. And I do pray, Lord, that you would help us to honor your will, and that we would honor your will with respect to marriage and family as well, and the task of parenting. So we do thank you, Lord, for this class, and I pray, Lord, that you continue to give us wisdom and discernment. We pray in Christ's name. Amen.